Here we are at the grave of Grace Gifford Plunkett, a woman who has been immortalised in song, one of the most famous songs of recent Irish history. The song will tell you the story of the fact that Grace married a man called Joseph Mary Plunkett, who would become one of the executed leaders of the 1916 Easter Rebellion. The song tells the story of their marriage in Kilmainham jail, the night before Joseph would be executed in the prison yard of that jail itself. Welcome to Glasnevin Cemetery. My name is Daniel. This is my colleague Ultan here, and we're tour guides here in the cemetery itself. Now today we visit 10 of some of the most famous graves around the cemetery itself. And as I say, this will give you a bit of a flavour as to the history we have on offer here in Glasnevin.
Glasnevin Cemetery was founded in the year 1832 by Daniel OConnell. Now Daniel OConnell had a revolutionary idea for the 19th century. He believed that regardless of your religious faith, you should be afforded the same dignity as anyone else. And so Glasnevin Cemetery has come to expand to over 124 acres of Dublin, and we currently have 1.6 million people buried here, including many influential statesmen, rebels, revolutionaries involved in the last 2 centuries of Irish history.
So now we'll go and talk about the man who founded Glasnevin Cemetery, the great liberator Daniel OConnell. So we'll head on over there now.
Daniel OConnell is buried in a crypt beneath the round tower behind me. Daniel OConnell's tower is 55 metres tall and has 198 steps to the very top. Today, people can climb all the way up to the top to get a great view of the city of Dublin and the surrounding area. Here we are in the crypt of Daniel OConnell, the founder of Glasnevin Cemetery. Throughout his life, Daniel OConnell campaigned peacefully for his goals, whether it be Catholic emancipation or the repeal of the Act of Union. To Daniel OConnell, he said, "It is a very fine thing to die for one's country, but one living patriot is worth more than a cemetery full of dead ones." Toward the end of his life, Daniel OConnell made a pilgrimage to Rome, where he hoped to receive a blessing from the Pope. But sadly, he died en route in the Italian city of Genoa. But before he died, he made a famous dying wish. He said, "My body to Ireland, my heart to Rome, and my soul to heaven." I'm standing now in the Republican plot of Glasnevin Cemetery, where many revolutionaries involved in the Easter Rising, the War of Independence and the Civil War are laid to rest. And that includes Countess Markovic, who's buried right here. The Countess Markovic was one of the most influential women in Irish history and was the first woman to be elected to Westminster. However, as a member of the Sinn Féin party, she did not take her seat in Westminster and instead became a member of our own Parliament in Dublin, Dáil Éireann. Here we are in the Jesuit plot of Glasnevin Cemetery, where members of the Jesuit order are buried, including Father Francis Browne. Father Browne was a passenger on the RMS Titanic. He got on the Titanic at Southampton in England, where it sailed to Cherbourg in France and from there to Cove in County Cork. Though he'd intended on going all the way to New York on the Titanic, he was ordered by his superiors to get off the ship, and he took the final picture of the Titanic as it sailed off into the Atlantic, never to be seen afloat again. Behind me is a cross of sacrifice dedicated to all those Irish people who fought and served with the British in 3 conflicts in our history: the Boer War, the First World War, and the Second World War. Here we are at the final resting place of President Eamon de Valera, one of the most influential figures in Irish history. As Taoiseach, or Prime Minister, he served as the head of government during what we call the emergency known across the world as the Second World War, during which he upheld Irish neutrality. His career extended from the 1916 Easter Rising almost right up to his death in the 1970s. Glasnevin Cemetery is surrounded by a series of walls and watchtowers which had a very real purpose. In the 19th century, cemeteries across the country had a terrible problem with not only grave robbing but also body snatching. People would come into cemeteries at night, take bodies that were recently laid to rest and sell them on to medical students studying the human body. And so these watchtowers and walls were built to prevent that from happening. The Watchtowers had armed guards stationed on them with rifles, given orders to shoot anyone spotted acting suspiciously in the cemetery, and we had packs of Cuban bloodhounds patrolling the cemetery at night. This is the final resting place of Jeremiah O'Donovan Rossall, a man involved in revolutionary politics in the 19th century. When he died in 1915, his body was brought here to Glasnevin, and his funeral was one of the most influential in Ireland's history. At the funeral, a man named Padraig Pearse stood forward from the crowd on this very spot and began the most famous speech in Irish history. At the end of his speech he said, "The fools, the fools, the fools. They have left us our Fenian dead, and while Ireland holds these graves, Ireland unfree shall never be at peace." Pearse went on to lead the 1916 Easter Rising, and the words of his speech were heard across the country, galvanising people to take up arms against British rule in Ireland.
This is the grave of the very Reverend John Spratt, D.D., Doctor of Divinity. Now, throughout his life in the 19th century, Spratt established a temperance movement here in Ireland aimed at getting us Irish people off alcohol. No, maybe not overly successful with that, but he worked very closely with the homeless right across Dublin City. Now, for the work he was doing with the homeless, he was awarded a position to work alongside Pope Gregory XVI in the Vatican. Now, John worked very successfully in the Vatican for a number of years, and eventually upon his retirement, the Pope decided to give him a fitting retirement present. Now, not given a bottle of whiskey or a nice watch or anything like that, as you may expect, instead was gifted with the remains of the 3rd century Saint Valentine. Now, John, I'm sure he wasn't really sure what to do with them at the time, but he decided to bring St. Valentine's remains back to Dublin, and he housed them in his church on Whitefriars Street in Dublin city centre, where the remains of St. Valentine are to this day. So many people may regard Paris or Rome as being the cities of love, but I surely must argue that it has to be Dublin if we have the 3rd century St. Valentine. Here we are at the grave of Grace Gifford Plunkett, a woman who has been immortalised in song, one of the most famous songs of recent Irish history. The song will tell you the story of the fact that Grace married a man called Joseph Mary Plunkett, who would become one of the executed leaders of the 1916 Easter Rebellion. The song tells the story of their marriage in Kilmainham jail, the night before Joseph would be executed in the prison yard of that jail itself. Now, Grace was a fervent Republican in her own right. She spent a good bit of time in Kilmainham jail herself, and she was a fantastic artist, publishing various art pieces in different Republican newspapers across the country for the rest of her life. She died in 1953, never having remarried after the death of her husband Joseph Plunkett in 1916. So here we are, what you can quite clearly see, the most visited grave in all of Glasnevin Cemetery. The flowers you see before us here are all left by members of the public, various societies and frequent admirers of this man here, Michael Collins. Michael Collins himself took part in the 1916 Easter Rebellion in Dublin, was sent off to an internment camp in Wales as a result, but when he returned, he became one of the most influential figures in the War of Independence here in Ireland. Collins launched a guerrilla campaign right across the country during the War of Independence from 1919 into 1921. Following the truce and the end of the fighting of the War of Independence, Collins became one of the leading figures in a delegation that travelled over to London to negotiate the terms of the Anglo-Irish Treaty. Now, eventually, when the treaty was signed, brought back to Dublin, it would A, divide the country in two. Now we have the 26 counties today that make up the Republic being separated away from this new entity being created, the 6 counties in the north forming Northern Ireland. Now, such division would lead to division within Sinn Féin, within the population of Ireland, and eventually this divide would lead to civil war. Throughout the Civil War, Collins was killed in an ambush just outside of his hometown of Clonakilty in County Cork, buried here in Glasnevin at the end of August 1922, and as you can see, almost 100 years later, is still the most frequently admired person buried within the cemetery itself. This is the final resting place of Kitty Kiernan Cronin. Now, if you've ever seen the movie Michael Collins starring Liam Neeson, you'll be familiar with the love story between Michael and this lady here, who became his fiancée. Kitty and Michael were engaged to be married while Collins was in London negotiating the terms of the Anglo-Irish Treaty in October 1921. The wedding never took place as a result of Collins being killed in the ambush in Bale na Bláth in August of 1922. Now, Kitty would go on to marry. She married a man called the Major General Felix Cronin, another member of the Free State Army, as Collins was during his life. She did maintain a love for Collins throughout the rest of her life, of course, as you may imagine, which is why, when she died, she requested from her husband that he bury her as close to Michael as possible. And to be fair to the husband, did a pretty good job. Kitty is here, buried just 6 graves away from the General Michael Collins himself.
So I hope you enjoyed this very brief snapshot into Glasnevin Cemetery and the people buried here.
You can book a ticket for an experience here in Glasnevin on our website, dctrust.ie. We run tours of the cemetery that will give you a much more in-depth view of some of the stories that are on offer here in Glasnevin Cemetery. And we hope to see you very soon.